A lot of people find this hard to believe, but I used to be a dancer. I guess you could say once a dancer, always a dancer. I started taking lessons, ballroom, 6th or 7th grade, dropped it, picked it up later on in life. But yeah, I can do 13 different smooth and Latin dances. I used to get hired to go to events because so few people dance today. Anyway, we're going to talk about dancing on this podcast, the podcast about podcasting, Build a Big Podcast, specifically the marketing podcast for podcasters. If you want to grow your podcast, attract a big audience, spread a message, make money with all of this, that's the kind of things that I cover. This is the audio edition of my weekly newsletter. That is called Big Podcast Insider. You can find it at newsletter.bigpodcast.com. If you want more information, all the links to the things that I'm talking about, that's where to find it, newsletter.bigpodcast.com. In this episode, a breakdancer, a podcaster, and a bodybuilder walk into a bar. The house of Big Podcast. A podcasting superpower. Oops, mom heard my podcast. 23 ways to monetize your podcast with examples. Also some classified ads, things that will help you to grow your podcast, get more people to your podcast, make a better podcast, a podcast that people care about, tell their friends about, and makes you money. The things that this podcast is about. This episode of Build a Big Podcast brought to you by Riverside.fm. It's a virtual studio that makes recording and editing at the highest quality possible accessible to anyone. You want to look and sound your best, and Riverside enables you to do that. You're going to bypass poor and unstable internet connections, get studio quality audio and video, lightning fast editing, instant transcripts powered by AI with 99% accuracy. Used to be the only way to do that was to hire somebody. Not anymore. Riverside's got it automated. It's going to save you money, and it's a lot quicker. You can edit audio and video by editing text. One of the things that I like is what they call magic clips. That transforms your long-form recording into bite-sized chunks with just a single click. How does it work? I don't know. I don't know how electricity works either. But I know that this gear that I'm talking into is powered by it, and it enables me to get my message out. Same with Riverside. These AI magic clips, one click, boom. You're going to get short clips to promote your podcast via social media. If you want to try it out, and you do want to try it out, they're going to let you get in there for free. A couple of hours, that's enough time to do an interview, maybe 2 interviews. Look at all the AI stuff, the transcripts, the social media clips, see how you like it. This is what you need to do. Go to riverside.fm, sign up for a free account. If you want to stick around, I've got a discount code for you. It's Big Podcast, BIGPODCAST. That's going to get you 15% off. The URL to get that free account, riverside.fm, the discount code to get 15% off if you want to stick around. Big Podcast, BIGPODCAST. All right, let's get to it. Going from thing to thing to thing. And as I mentioned earlier, if you want more information, if you want the links to things that I'm talking about, you will find all of that at newsletter.bigpodcast.com. This is issue number 194. Because I'm going from thing to thing to thing, you will hear this sound in between the things. That's how you know that I'm moving on. Ready? Here we go. A breakdancer, a podcaster, and a bodybuilder walk into a bar. By now, you've probably read about the breakdancing situation in the Paris Olympics. If not, I've got a quick video that's going to get you up to speed. This is from an Australian news outlet. It was an Australian breakdancer, or breaker is the more appropriate term. I say breakdancer because people don't know what a breaker is. You might think I'm talking about electricity. Just like when you say podcast, that means something to some people. Some people think it's on YouTube. Other people, they're not going to go to YouTube. You got to be clear in what you're talking about. That's the reason I'm calling her a breakdancer, but she's a breaker. She had a very, let's call it mixed performance, depending on who you ask, at the Paris Olympics. This is why I bring it up on a podcast about podcasting. There is always an old guard who is very attached to what was and wants to protect that. At the same time, and I think this is important to remember, if you're a new podcaster, it's important to remember if you're an old podcaster. There are a lot of established people, and they are more than willing to help newer or less experienced people if you show up correctly, if you respect them, if you ask for help. And this works one or two ways. Like I said, if you're a new podcaster, maybe you need to ask for that help. If you're an older podcaster, offer that help. Not in a critical way. By God, back in my day, we had to code our own RSS. Nobody cares. Nobody cares. That's the past, man. Yesterday's news. But you know a lot, and you can help somebody that wasn't there for you because you were walking uphill to school both ways and coding your own RSS feed and doing who knows what to get your podcast out, having to plug in an iPod, manually download each episode. Yeah, we know. We know nobody was there to teach you. You had to figure it out on your own. Let's not do that for the upcoming podcasters. Let's spread podcasting. And we can do that by being cool with the newbies. An example, and I've seen this time and time again, as somebody who's spent a lot of time in the gym over the years. I mean, I used to work out 7 days a week, man. And I still work out, I don't know, 5 or 6 days a week. If you go to the gym and you find the biggest, scariest dudes, they are usually the coolest people there. They are really into it. And they are more than happy, most of the time, not all of them, but most of the time, they're more than happy to share their knowledge and excitement about weightlifting or training or diet, exercise with others. You got to listen. You got to be cool. You can't be a jerk. If you show up, though, and you care, and they see you continuing to show up, they are going to help you because they want other people in with them. If we don't get new people into podcasting, we are not going to have podcasting. And that includes new listeners, and that includes podcasters. We're basically like a cigarette company. Everybody's dying. You got to get new people in. Back to breakdancing. I want to talk about what the head judge for the Olympics said. Breaking is all about originality and bringing something new to the table and representing your country or region. Head judge Martin Gillian, that's his name. He's known as MG Bility. He said in a press conference that that's exactly what Ray Gunn was doing. Rachel Gunn, her real name. She got inspired by her surroundings, which in this case was, for example, a kangaroo. She's from Australia. Kangaroo. The breaking hip-hop communities definitely stand behind her. The general public was having fun at her expense, but the general public has no idea what it takes to do what she did. Just like the general public has no idea what it takes for you to make a podcast. You sound smooth on the mic, you're editing, right? Well, yeah, you can sound smooth at that point. They don't hear the stumbles, the stutters, the false starts, all the work that you had to do to mic yourself, all the work that you had to do to figure out how to plug this stuff in, how to properly speak into it, how to pronounce things. You know, I joke around about this. I wasn't saying podcast correctly. I listened back on some tape. It's like podcat. I wasn't using a de-esser. Somehow I just missed the S, podcat. It's podcast. That's bad when you have a podcast about podcasting called Build a Big Podcast. But here we are, and you're there too. It takes us a little time to get things right. People don't see the come up. That's what they say about overnight sensations. Every overnight sensation takes 7 years, 3 years, 2 years, 6 months, whatever. But it's not overnight. I want to be this kind of person for podcasters. So I'm starting a new segment of this podcast. It's going to answer questions from listeners, from you. If you want to reach out to me, you can do that via Mastodon, Blue Sky, or Threads. I've got the links at newsletter.bigpodcast.com. Let me know your podcasting question. One of the ones that I'm working on now that I hope to have very soon in the next few days, I'm going to do an overrated or underrated or accurately rated episode, looking at some common podcasting things such as the Blue Yeti, Audacity, podcasting conferences, high-end microphones. Are these things overrated, underrated, or are they accurately rated? I want to talk about the pros and cons of all those things. If you have not subscribed to this podcast, this is how to do it. bigpodcast.com/subscribe. That will make sure that you get every episode. I've made it easy for you. One click is all it takes. iPhone, Android, an RSS feed, whatever you want, man, I got it for you. Yeah, I see you, old school podcaster, the guy doing your own RSS feed. Uphill both ways every time you recorded a podcast. I got you. bigpodcast.com/subscribe. That's where to go. Do it now before you forget, and I will get you that overrated, underrated, or accurately rated episode. Let's talk about Big Podcast AMP. If you like the newsletter, you like the podcast, you're going to love Big Podcast AMP. That stands for Audio Monetization Program. It's a personal coaching program. It lets me work with you one-on-one. And this is what we work on: growing your podcast audience, getting people to talk about your podcast, making money with your podcast, and also your podcasting skills. Nice voice, editing, consulting. Yeah, man. I can put you to work and get you some money. Let's talk about it. Big Podcast AMP. You can find out more information, bigpodcast.com/AMP. The House of Big Podcast. This is kind of a joke. I see these signs all the time. It says, "In this house, we believe." And usually, maybe for every one of these things that I've seen, it is a more, I would say, liberal and inclusive message. Love is love. Practice your own religion. I don't know exactly what it says. There are about 5 or 6 things. And one of the things that I did, and you can see this at newsletter.bigpodcast.com, I took that format, the In This House We Believe format, and I made something called the House of Big Podcast. I did it for two reasons. One, I want to let you know where I stand. So if you're curious about where I stand, you can see it, newsletter.bigpodcast.com, issue number 194. But I also wanted to bring up that I'm talking to you, you'll benefit by letting your listeners know where you stand. Podcasting is not a something for everybody format. People are coming to you and listening to you. We've heard these three: like, know, and trust. But also a fourth thing, because they agree with you. Do they agree with you? Not if you don't let them know where you stand. That's going to make the people who do agree with you love you even more. And yeah, you're going to repel some people. But the people who really love you, they're going to tell their friends about you. And it doesn't have to be crazy. You can go look at the House of Big Podcast, newsletter.bigpodcast.com, issue number 194. Think about this. You're trying to keep everybody happy. I've seen people do it. And what they think is, I don't want to lose anybody. I don't want to mail my mailing list. People might unsubscribe. And if I say something in that mailing, even more people will unsubscribe. I've seen those guys. But what ends up happening is it's something for everybody, which means it's nothing for everybody. Not really. People want to know you, like you, trust you, and also agree with you. Linked to this, and again, you're going to find this at newsletter.bigpodcast.com. I've got something called 10 podcasting lessons in 282 words. That lets you know where I stand. This House of Big Podcast, it's where I stand, but it's also kind of a joke, a spoof of these signs that you might have seen around. The 10 podcasting lessons in 282 words, that's the real deal. And if you follow those 10 lessons, again, they're linked at newsletter.bigpodcast.com. You will have a better podcast. You'll have a podcast with a more engaged audience. You will have a more popular podcast because of that. You can find all this information, newsletter.bigpodcast.com, issue number 194. Your podcasting superpower. What is it? It's empathy. I've talked about that. You read my book, right? You know I wrote this book. It's called Big Podcast. You can find it on Amazon. Just search for Big Podcast. I talk about empathy. It works with your listeners. It also works with guests. Alfred Adler's got a great description of it. He says this: empathy is seeing with the eyes of another, listening with the ears of another, and feeling with the heart of another. When you have empathy or develop it, it can be developed. Your podcast has an enormous advantage. Again, I wrote about this in my book. I've been talking about this for years. So if you've been listening to me, you probably heard this before. Regardless, I've got a quick video that I want you to look at. It's 2 minutes and 23 seconds. It is linked at newsletter.bigpodcast.com. This is issue number 194, because I feel that it can be helpful to hear the same or similar messages said in different ways. And before I move on, I want you to think about that. There are only so many clicks of the dial to the things that we talk about on our podcast. Here I talk about building an audience. I talk about how to make your message connect. I talk about building rapport, increasing empathy. I can show you how to do that in different ways, and that's what I'm getting at. You can go deeper on this stuff, really internalize it, and have it be more effective for you than it might initially appear, and you've got that thing too. What I see happen with a lot of podcasters is they say, I've already talked about that. We've already covered that. We've already had this guest. We've already had this topic. Okay, but have you talked about it in this way? If you have already discussed it with one guest, why not bring in another guest to talk about the same topic? I just did an episode of Music Business Radio this week. We were talking about music licensing. And music licensing, really music supervision, let's call it. A music supervisor licenses music for, let's say, the theme song for a TV show or the theme song for a movie. Maybe a specific scene, a car chase, a romance. You would need two different types of music. Well, I've talked about that topic a bajillion times, but this guy's got stories about how things have worked out, how the songs that got in movies. I've got stories I can add to that. I've got experiences. He's got experiences. We can cover it from a different level. Every podcaster has this. So do not be afraid of covering these different topics from a different angle, with different people. Maybe it's the opposite angle. On one episode, maybe the approach is, this is why you want to do this. A second episode, this is why you don't want to do this. Split those episodes up. Anyway, the video on empathy, more thoughts on this, newsletter.bigpodcast.com, issue number 194. Oops, Mom heard my podcast. Take it back to music business radio. I haven't had this happen with podcasting guests too much, but with musician guests, yeah. We get so comfortable in that studio. I got guys telling me all sorts of stuff that I don't think they realize how many people are listening to the show. Not when we're recording. I've talked about this before. I'm in a 5x8 room. It's a tricked out closet, and I'm just talking to me right now. But you come in later, and you can imagine how powerful that is when you've got a huge radio tower behind you. Anyway, I've had more than a few episodes where a guest will call me immediately after taping, after thinking about this, and say something like, could you remove that thing where I said, it's easy to get so comfortable when we're recording that we forget what we record is actually heard by others. A funny story, during the holidays, this was right after Thanksgiving, I got a letter from a podcaster. He was telling me how awkward his Thanksgiving holiday was because his entire family had listened to his podcast. You want to talk about word of mouth. Hey, did you hear this podcast by Stan? Yeah, you might want to listen to it. Then the next guy, hey, Mom, did you hear this podcast by Stan? You might want to check this out. Anyway, you can imagine sitting down, Lord bless this food. Stan, listen, we got to talk about your podcast. Did you really mean that? That's word of mouth, and that can work against you. But yeah, people listen to your podcast. You never know. Another funny story, and I have this linked, is at newsletter.bigpodcast.com. In the you never know who's listening to a podcast files. The FBI is. An Instagram scammer got nabbed after bragging about it on a podcast. It's a funny story. Well, not for him and not for the people that he scammed, but a funny story because you'll think, oh, yeah. I've had those awkward moments like Thanksgiving or somebody that I know has heard my podcast, and maybe I shouldn't have said that. More thoughts, all this linked, newsletter.bigpodcast.com, episode number 194. 23 ways to monetize your podcast with examples. I have all of these linked at newsletter.bigpodcast.com. I'm going to go over 3 of them now. I'll give you a bonus one too. These are my top 3. I love membership. I've been involved with membership online for a long time. I have made this argument before. Nobody's disputed me on it. It is true as best I know that I had the first non-adult membership site on the internet. It was a music business site. And the way that I came up with the concept, by the way, watching the adult business and what they're doing, because they lead the way with technology and billing, they take all the risks, and then it drips down to the rest of us. Kind of like California in the US. Whatever happens in California, a few years later, that trickles over to the rest of the United States. Anyway, these adult guys, they were playing fast and loose with technology, with billing. They were doing these recurring payments. I had the idea, not from the adult sites necessarily, although again, I recognize recurring billing and good ideas when I see them. Fan clubs. We were doing fan clubs in the music industry. You used to send in a check, $29.95 to ZZ Top. They'll send you the fake beard, the keychain, backstage passes, whatever. Newsletter. It's recurring billing. Why not take that online? Put some videos, some demos, bonus content. I've been doing membership for a long time. It is great for most podcasts, either entertainment podcasts, because you've got fans that want to discuss your show, or if your podcast is like this podcast, Build a Big Podcast, where you're going over how to do something better, improvement, how to get rid of something, weight, a bad co-host. Membership is a nice option. I like membership because of the recurring billing. If you want to see how I'm doing this, I've talked about Big Podcast AMP, the audio monetization program, bigpodcast.com/AMP if you want to check that out. And ironically, this is going to fold over onto itself. If you want to talk about setting up a membership program for your website, working with me through Big Podcast AMP, the audio monetization program, that's how we would do that. Anyway, check it out, newsletter.bigpodcast.com. The second thing, merch. This is another music business thing. I've talked about this story. Band, yeah, you might have heard of them. They had one song on MTV and a show called 120 Minutes, but, not really. There's a band who traveled throughout the Southeast. I don't know how many records they sold, tens of thousands, but not in the gold or platinum range. No big radio hits. They sold $1 million worth of t-shirts. And this is back in the early 90s, when $1 million meant something. It still means something. Can you imagine $1 million worth of t-shirts? Merch is huge. Another funny story. I worked with a band called Run DMC, King of Rock. Remember that? All right. Google it. Anyway, this is related. This is back when I was single. I see this woman, she's in a Run DMC t-shirt. And I'm trying to be cool. And I walk up to her and go, oh man, Run DMC, man. Yeah, I used to work for them. And she's like, I'm more of a Jay-Z fan. She thought it was a fashion brand. I mean, she knew it was rap music, but she had him for the logo. She didn't know King of Rock. She didn't know My Adidas, Walk This Way. These guys are making more money on merch than music right now. And you see the same thing with the Ramones, Danzig, CBGBs. I saw a guy in a Minor Threat shirt. Anything you're going to see at Hot Topic, these guys are killing it at merch. Not so much with music. Maybe. Something related to this. You might have seen this Lou Pearlman documentary right now called The Boy Band Scam on Netflix. And he talked about New Kids on the Block. $200 million worth of albums. But $800 worth of merch. 4-1. And you might have heard me talk about the band Alabama, country music band from the 80s that was doing something similar as far as that ratio. $100,000 to play a gig, but every gig, $400,000 of merch. Merch is big. That's one of the reasons that I love it. You want thoughts on it? Hey, I got a program for that. AMP, audio monetization program, bigpodcast.com/AMP for more information. Number 3, live events. Let's take it back to Alabama. $100,000 per gig. Not bad, but you got to get there. You got to have a bus, equipment. You got to pay people. You got to actually do some work. Not that sending out t-shirts and merch isn't work, but live events, a good way to connect with people. It's worth doing the work. It is probably the best way to build an audience. And you can also make money. You're promoting what it is that you do. You've got an opportunity to sell merch. You're getting paid for that live event, but you're bringing in community because it's not about you. It's about the audience. People don't go to live events alone. They bring a friend. They're going to tell their friend about your podcast. They're going to experience that thing together. Live events are great. Those are my top 3. There are 23 of these. Let me give you a bonus one. Sponsorship. And we can take it back to live events, merch, membership. You can sell sponsorship for any of this stuff. People want the audience that you are talking to. You heard an ad at the top of this episode. You could have New Kids on the Block, sponsored by Viagra. Hey, we're all getting older. Back in the day, though, it would have been something like New Kids on the Block, sponsored by Bonnie Bell Lip Smackers, sponsored by Stridex, whatever. My point in bringing these examples up is there's a very specific audience listening to whatever it is that you do. And different brands, depending on who is listening, will pay for your relationship and access to those people. So sponsorship is great. Again, the full list, I've got it linked, newsletter.bigpodcast.com. And if you do want personal help with monetization, Big Podcast AMP, bigpodcast.com/AMP. Classified ads for you. These are things that will help you to grow your podcast, get more people to your podcast, make a podcast that people care about and that makes you money. Podpage. You need a website for your podcast. Preferably, it is the name of your podcast.com. And when somebody types that in, where are they going to go? If you use Podpage, you can join over 25,000 podcasters and automatically create a beautiful listener-friendly podcast site from your RSS feed. All right, old school podcasters, you coded that thing by hand. Boom, pop it into Podpage. You've got your beautiful listener-friendly podcast site. No reason to work any harder than you need to. It's super easy. You can try it for free. Put your feed in there, see how it works. I've got the link, newsletter.bigpodcast.com. Cast Magic, automated episode notes. 35,000 podcasters use this, not just for episode notes, but highlight clips, podcast summaries, blog posts, social media posts, newsletters. You upload your audio and Cast Magic does the rest. It is so easy to do episode notes. I know, not the funnest thing. You didn't get into podcasting because you wanted to type up everything you just talked about. You wanted to just talk. Cast Magic lets you do that. You can try it for free. Upload your audio. See how it works for you. I've got a special link for you. Newsletter.bigpodcast.com. When you're ready, this is how I can help you even more. I've talked about Big Podcast AMP, the audio monetization program. That's at bigpodcast.com/AMP. Personal coaching for indie podcasters to help you grow your podcast audience. Also, build your authority, brand, and reputation. I've talked about my background working with some of these bigger artists in the music industry. Work with a lot of brands. Worked with Victoria's Secret, FedEx. Too many to mention here. You can find my full bio at bigpodcast.com. And if you want to work with me, bigpodcast.com/AMP. That is the least expensive way to do it. Speaking of less expensive, What's cheaper than Big Podcast AMP? I got some free stuff for you. You'll find it all linked at bigpodcast.com. I've got an almost daily email that goes out. I've got this newsletter.bigpodcast.com, that goes out once a week. I've got a podcast growth toolkit. I call it the Swiss Army knife of podcasting. This has contracts in it, music licensing. I talked about that. If you're using music from a band that you want them to sign off on it, you do. Trust me. Don't get caught up in some kind of legal dispute once you put this thing out online. You want to cover yourself? I've got a contract that'll do that for you. It's all at bigpodcast.com. Thank you for listening to Build a Big Podcast. As I mentioned, coming up on Build a Big Podcast, I've got the overrated, underrated, or accurately rated episodes coming up, talking about some common podcasting things and looking at them in ways that you might not have thought of. Things like expensive mics, cheap mics, Audacity, Blue Yeti, podcasting conferences, live events. Overrated, underrated, or accurately rated. We're going to look at all of these things, give you ideas to how to grow your podcast, make a podcast that people care about, make a podcast that makes you money, and makes your mother proud. I'm online at bigpodcast.com. Go see me there. Subscribe to this podcast before you forget. And I'll see you on the next episode of Build a Big Podcast.